kicking things off. This presentation is a little different from what we've done with Smart Politics in the past. This is the introductory webinar for our project for the year. The project is called It's Not Too Late, and it's really about bringing MAGA voters home, because we know a lot of you have friends, families, neighbors who have kind of strayed perhaps from who they've always been, and you have developed a sense of alienation perhaps from your loved ones. And what we're here to tell you is it's not too late. They aren't lost forever, and there are actually things that you can do to help bring them back. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Karen Tamarius. I'm a political psychiatrist, and there aren't many political psychiatrists out there, so you're probably wondering, what is that? First of all, I'm trained in political science. That means I'm an expert in political behavior and political psychology, basically why people do what they do, how they change their minds and make up their minds about politics, where political beliefs come from. But I'm also a medical doctor, and as a medical doctor, I'm trained in psychiatry, which means I also know a lot about how to talk with people in a way that it helps them change. Not change in ways that are imposed from the outside, but change in ways that bring them more in alignment with their own values and goals in life. Joining me tonight is Locke Petersheim. He is like a man of all trades. He helps with the writing of pieces. He's an editor in his own right. He used to be a school teacher. And so we really have teamed up to bring this It's Not Too Late project to you. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize that Locke brings to this project is that he lives both in a red community and in a blue community. So in some ways, he's a lot more skilled than I am at kind of navigating those two worldviews and really being able to develop close relationships with people across the political spectrum. So he's a great source of advice and guidance when I'm not around. So the agenda tonight, we're gonna move through these fairly fast, but I also want you to be thinking as we go through it. If you have questions, you can make a note in the Mentimeter app as we go along, but also in the chat, and Locke's going to be monitoring that. The first thing,
Karen always says that I can help with tech issues. You can tell me about your tech issues, and I'll probably, chances are the response will be, I don't know, good luck. But seriously, if you do have a tech problem with anything, we know in the chat. If you're here, that means you got here, so that's the main one.
But also content questions. Locke can definitely help with that and bring them to my attention if I'm missing it. The first thing we're going to talk about is just kind of how I know it's not too late, how we know it's not too late. Why are we making this effort when in a lot of ways it seems like opinion change is really hard, and that Trump voters, MAGA voters aren't particularly interested in hearing our perspective. The second thing we're going to be discussing is I'll be introducing a de-radicalization process, a process that was originally proposed by Stephen Hassan, who's an expert in cults, and I find it aligns really nicely with the Smart Politics philosophy while having a really proven track record in situations where people are ensconced in belief systems that don't necessarily make a lot of sense. Then I'm going to tell you more about the It's Not Too Late project itself and how you can get involved. And we're going to outline some next steps that you can follow. Finally, I am going to introduce the AI Angry Uncle Bot, which is a chatbot I created to help you practice having some of these really difficult conversations before you take them out in the real world with your loved ones. It's surprising how well AI can mimic these challenging conversations, so you can really get good at it in advance. All right, let's get started and talk about how we know it's not too late. The first question I really want to address here is, how do we know people can change? We know people can change, first of all, because that's how brains work. Brains are designed to be able to adapt to circumstances. And when our environments change, then our beliefs about the world change too. We also know, just from looking around us, that there are plenty of famous people who have changed their minds on really major issues, including about Donald Trump. As a matter of fact, if you kind of look at the track record of people who worked with Donald Trump over time, almost everybody he's worked with has at some point, or at least worked closely with, has at some point left the fold and turned against him. So we know people do change their minds about Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. We also know that we personally have changed our minds about things. It's common to kind of forget how often we change our own minds, but keeping that in mind is important, that if we can change our minds, then our loved ones must be able to change their minds too. And finally, one of the things that I think is really helpful is to remember our loved ones, even if they're MAGA now, have probably changed their minds in the past about something really important. If nothing else, they had to change their minds to become Trump supporters in the present. They weren't always that way. So something happened to lead them to this point, And that means something can happen to have them go back to where they were before. So why is it then that we have this sense that it's so hard for people to change? If change is something that's really happening all the time, if we've changed, if they've changed, why do we have this sense of immutability? The real reason is because of the way our brains work. And our brains are biased to see the world in a constant way. To see consistency where there might not be consistency. This creates a sense of change blindness. So when we're looking back into the past, often it's hard to see those moments where we've changed or where other people have changed. And because of that, we underestimate the capacity for people to change in the present or in the future. So I want you now to just take a minute and think about, what is an issue you've changed your mind about over the course of your life? And type it in. You can type it in either to the chat, or if you're using Mentimeter, add it in the Mentimeter app. And some of the things you might be thinking about that people have talked about in the past are, exactly, changing their mind on abortion, changing their mind about marriage equality, changing their commitment to a religion, right? So there are some really big things that people shift on over the course of their lives. Death penalty, yeah. Christianity. This is another one where I love seeing it populate. The patterns are always really interesting.
Let's throw some out here from the chat as they come in. Corporal punishment.
Ooh, that's an interesting one. I like all of these. Yeah. Yeah, corporal punishment is a common one that particularly if people grew up in a household where corporal punishment was the norm, then yeah. And some of these things are like notoriously hard to change, like people's attitudes about religion, people's attitudes about political party, right? These are things that kind of go to the core of who people are, part of their identity, things they grew up with. And yet these are things that many of us have shifted our beliefs about. And I imagine some of you, as you're looking at this list, are starting to realize, oh yeah, I did change my mind about things. I didn't realize that there were so many things that I've shifted my opinion about. One of the ones that usually shows up here that I'm not seeing is racism. Racism is often a topic that people mention where they've changed their mind, particularly about the pervasiveness of racism within society or the existence of systemic racism. All right, let's move on. Thanks, folks. So today, I'd like to talk about one really dramatic case of opinion change that I think demonstrates all of the principles I'm talking about and kind of reminds us that change is not only possible, but it can happen it can happen fast and it can happen like at scale. And the topic I'm addressing today is marriage equality. What this graph shows is support for same-sex marriage in the United States going back to about 1996 and continuing through 2021. Back in the mid-90s, fewer than 30% of the American public actually supported same-sex marriage. That meant the vast majority of Americans thought that it was wrong, shouldn't be legal. But that shifted dramatically between then and now. And now we're looking at more than 70% of Americans believe that marriage equality should exist, that same-sex marriage should be legal, and that people of the same sex who marry should have all the same rights as people of different sex. So one of the things that people often say when they first see that is, well, if you want to understand why that change happened, it happened probably because there were a lot of people who died out and were replaced by younger generations who thought that marriage equality was okay. And while that's a really plausible hypothesis, it actually isn't the whole story. In reality, what we find is that this shift in attitudes didn't just occur across generations, it occurred within generations. That means that baby boomers changed their minds about abortion at roughly the same rate as, or not abortion, but about same-sex marriage, as millennials changed their minds about same-sex marriage. Gen X changed their minds at roughly the same age as the silent generation. So yes, there were baseline differences in support, but overall, the rate of change was the same. So this means that people can change even if they aren't particularly, don't have the same predisposition, that you're never too old to actually shift your beliefs. The other thing that's important to understand about this shift was it just wasn't just confined to people on the more liberal end of the scale. Yes, Democrats were initially more supportive of same-sex marriage than Republicans, and ultimately have ended up in a place that is more supportive of same-sex marriage than Republicans. But the reality is both Democrats and Republicans have become more supportive of same-sex marriage over time. And so this isn't something that is going to be, when we talk about change, we can realize that everybody is capable of change. It's not just people who have a more liberal predisposition. So this brings us to a question now. We've already looked at ourselves, but I want you to think about the Republicans around you, the voters around you who perhaps are now voting for Trump, and consider what changes have you seen them make in their lives in terms of their beliefs. And it's important to be aware that these changes can be both positive and negative in the sense that they may over time have begun to align more with your beliefs, or they may have grown farther apart from you in terms of their beliefs. But what I want to document here is the fact that Republicans do change their minds. They aren't fixed. Okay, voted for a serial rapist. You know, it's interesting. That's kind of a funny response, but at the same time, if you had asked a Republican 10 years ago, right, if they could see themselves voting for a person who was a serial rapist, what would they have said to you? They would have said, of course not. Or if you'd asked them, would you vote for someone who has been accused of rape? They would have said, of course not, right? So something has happened to change their behavior, their way of thinking about the candidates. Gender identity, yeah. January 6th, that's an interesting one. So I've seen people on January 6th go both ways. Like I've seen Republicans who are initially horrified by January 6th make a change toward justifying it and dismissing it, while others I've seen who initially defended the January 6th insurrectionists now coming around and saying, actually, that wasn't okay. So that's one where it's definitely gone both directions. One authoritative leader. Yeah, a lot of Republicans historically are people who are a bit more libertarian in their bent, and as such aren't particularly interested in having a dictator. But talk to a lot of Republicans now, and they'll actually give you reasons for why the United States is in such dire shape that we have no choice but to resort to a dictatorship.
A good one.
Racism. Yeah, go
Good
ahead,
one from the
Locke.
chat is small government to big government among Republicans.
Yeah. Interesting. And also sometimes those things exist simultaneously, right? When you're talking about one topic, they'll talk about how they want small government, but you're talking about another subject, they'll talk about how they want big government. So there can be some ambivalence there.
In Iowa, that is seen as the can't stand welfare queens. These people are living on the state, but I'm going to go put up another mailbox and get my second farmer subsidy check.
There you go.
The joke in Iowa is, how do you double a farmer's income? You put up a second mailbox. Another good one in the chat, COVID-19 vaccine.
Yeah. Wow. That one was really intense, right? And people went so many different ways with that. Conspiracy theories. Yeah, that one's been really interesting. The way some people, you can see them get sucked into those rabbit holes, and it happens really, really fast, often when it occurs. Support for Russia is another really fascinating one. You know, it can be very simple to often to trace back people who in the 1980s were utterly opposed to the USSR and now are huge supporters of Russia and Putin. Great. A lot of things going on here that are accurate. Any more things in the chat, Lock? Or is this,
No, we're caught up.
we're caught up? Okay.
Appreciate it, folks. Appreciate you sharing in the chat when you need to.
Yeah. And here, this is great. I love seeing all these things coming up. Threats of violence. Yeah. Support for political violence is definitely increasing. Okay. So one of the things that I often hear when I first start talking to people about this is they say to me, well, I've tried. If they were going to change their minds, they would have already. But here's the painful truth, but also hopeful truth, is that you probably haven't been approaching them in the most effective way. A lot of the ways that we try to change Republicans' minds are simply counterproductive and ineffective. If, however, you start using the right approaches, start approaching people in the methods that I teach and in the methods that others teach, you can see that you will have a real impact on their thinking. So I want to stop here for just 1 second, see if there are any questions. I'm guessing, Locke, you haven't seen any? Okay,
No,
and I'm
but
not seeing any here.
yeah, but if you just a good point to remind you, if you have if as Karen is talking, you have a question about something she puts up on the screen or a point she makes, feel free to throw it in the chat. We'll take these little pauses regularly, and I will read them out from the chat. If you're using Mentimeter, and every time I say Mentimeter, I pop it in the chat. How to YouTube. Don't take a shot. I just pop it in the chat. If you're using Mentimeter, you can throw it in there, and they will collect, and Karen can scroll back and see them later.
This is true. All right, everybody, if you're ready, let's move on. So what is this fancy de-radicalization process I'm talking about? This is Stephen Hassan. He's a psychologist and an expert in cults. And in particular, he's an expert in how to help people get out of cults. He got interested in this because he is a former cult member himself. During his first year of college, he was recruited by the Moonies, and within a very short period of time, became convinced that the leader of the Moonies was the second coming of Jesus, and got cut off ties with his family, and eventually, mostly through a lucky event in which he broke his leg and ended up in the hospital and needed to be cared for by his family, he was eventually able to be helped out of the cult. But once he did that and he realized what had happened to him, he decided to study this phenomenon. And he's the author of multiple books on cults. Two that I really recommend are The Cult of Trump, in which he really looks at the MAGA phenomenon and tries to explain it through the lens of a cult of personality. And second, Freedom of Mind, which is really a self-help book for families who've lost loved ones to cults and are looking to help them back. He initially was involved in learning about deprogramming efforts, but he felt that they were a serious violation of people's autonomy and personal freedom. And so he developed another approach, which is called the strategic intervention approach, which really honors the dignity and autonomy of the person who was caught up in a controlling belief system or organization, but still connects with them well enough to help them, kind of find their way back. One of the quotes that he has shared that I find really powerful is, he says, "Giving up is a dysfunctional coping mechanism, specifically a coping mechanism that a lot of family members use when their loved one gets sucked into a cult. They just can't deal with the frustration and the emotional turmoil. And so rather than continue to maintain their connection to their loved one, they cut off ties and give up hope." And that really is the worst thing that you can do in a situation where your loved one is being pulled into a belief system like that. So you might be wondering now, why are we talking about cults when we're talking about MAGA? And really what it comes down to is that MAGA and Trumpism resemble a cult of personality. And if you take a look at Hassan's book, he really dives into this deeper. For me, I'm a bit agnostic on the whole question of whether Trumpism constitutes a cult or doesn't constitute a cult. For me, what really matters is this is a method that can bring people back when they're caught up in an all-consuming belief system that really seems disconnected from reality. So I embrace this method because it works and it's consistent with what I've always taught in Smart Politics. So step one is to connect with your loved one. For some of you, this is going to mean reestablishing connection after a breach. I know a lot of people in the wake of the 2016 election really cut off ties with family members who voted for Trump. For some people, that was because, getting together just was too stressful. Everything seemed to end up in arguments about politics. In other cases, it was really more a feeling of principle. Like, if I stay engaged with this person, I am somehow condoning their behavior and their political beliefs, and by extension, I'm condoning Trump, and I just really can't do that. Those feelings are all understandable, but if you actually want people to change and to come back from Trumpism and MAGA, you need to reverse that course and go back and reconnect. That means reestablishing contact, healing the relationship, and rebuilding or building for the first time some kind of strong rapport, a feeling that you really have a valuable relationship that is worth maintaining. So one of the tools that we use in Smart Politics, and I'm not going to go into this in depth tonight, but I do want to give you a little taste of it, is what I call the trust pyramid. And the trust pyramid is really the heart of what it takes to establish rapport with someone. The trust pyramid is built from the bottom up, which means that the things at the bottom of the pyramid are most important and need to be established before you can move to higher levels in the pyramid. When you're establishing connection or reconnecting with loved ones and creating rapport, really the first two things at the base of the pyramid are the most important. That means you need to make them feel comfortable. That means being safe feeling like you're not trying to control them, that you're being non-judgmental, that you care about them no matter what they think, what they believe, that you recognize that they are a good person fundamentally, at their core. And it also means connecting in ways that remind both of you of the things you like about each other, the things you have in common, and taking some risks, taking a chance to open yourself up and make yourself vulnerable. When you do that, they're likely to reciprocate and in turn make themselves vulnerable in ways that allow you to bond strongly. The second step after you have reconnected and really built that rapport is to gather information. What do we mean by that? You want to get to know what it is about, in this case, MAGA and Trumpism and the Republican Party that is so appealing to them. Why is it that they've formed such a strong connection to this? And what does it mean to them? Now, among other things, so that's what you want to know about them in the present. But it's also really helpful to learn about them in the past. You want to dig into, before Trump came along, what were their political beliefs? Have they always been like this really strong authoritarian? Have they always believed that the country was going to hell in a handbasket? Did they always think that abortion was wrong? Did they always think that it was okay for someone who had been, convicted, or who was undergoing a lot of criminal cases and other court cases to be president? Like, find out what their values were before Trump. And a lot of what you're doing in the process is really getting at what Stephen Hassan calls their authentic self. You're trying to unearth their core values. And one of the questions I really like to use during the gathering information stage is asking people, what is your ideal president like? Put aside Trump and Biden. Let's imagine a world where Trump and Biden don't exist. What are the characteristics of the kind of person you would like to see president of the United States? That's a way to really drill down and get back to what their core values are. And sometimes simply doing that will help them see the contrast between what they believe now and how they behave now and where their beliefs have been in the past. Ultimately, though, this gathering of information isn't about changing their minds. It's simply a reconnaissance mission. Mostly what you are trying to do is hear them out so you can understand them better.
I want to give Karen a break on her voice for a second and throw in some of my thoughts. In addition to that, it's more of a correction of your mind, not more, but it's partly a correction of your mind. Because after 8 years or however many years it's been, we've all lost track of social media and media perceptions and Trump rallies and social media posts. A lot of us on the left have built up an idea of what we think the Trump voter is and who they are and what motivates them and how they feel about every issue, because we see all the stuff flying at us. A lot of times you need to kind of clear that from your mind and ask them, because they may not feel about some of the issues or have the motivations you think they do in the narrative that you've created after years of seeing this stereotype of the MAGA hat, red hat wearing, Trump voter. So asking that question is both a way to find out where they're coming from and also to kind of calm some of your stereotypes down so you can approach them who they really are. I know when I talk to my relatives, A lot of times they respond with different things about different opinions and different reasons I had kind of concocted in my mind for why I thought they probably voted for Trump.
Thanks. That's, yeah, excellent reminder. And we can teach you how to do that, how to ask questions that really get to the heart of these things. And so in terms of understanding this, like, gathering of information, that's really what happens at the center stage, or the center level of the trust pyramid. That's where we're getting to that place where we really understand where they're coming from, and we're both showing them that we are trying really hard to get their perspective on things, which is gonna, they'll trust us more if they see how hard we're working to understand them. And as Locke says, it's gonna temper our own feelings, and because we're gonna start to see things better from their perspective. Doesn't mean we're gonna agree with them, but it'll be easier to understand how they could cast the votes that they cast. Now, the next thing that the second tool that we use predominantly in smart politics is called the Persuasion Conversation Cycle. And so when you're trying to establish comprehension, it's the first 3 steps of the Persuasion Conversation Cycle that we're using. It's asking questions, listening to the answers, and reflecting back what we've heard. Reflecting back means basically to summarize what they said in a way that shows we've really heard them. Taken together, these 3 steps, ask, listen, and reflect, doing that in a cyclical process is called looping to understand. And it can be a really powerful way to both gain comprehension and show people that we're trying to hear them, and show that that they can trust us because we really do care about their perspective. The third step in the process, once we've really reached a good understanding of where they're coming from, is to cultivate doubt. What we're not going to do is go in there and tell them why they're wrong. We're not going to go in and say, well, you may believe all of those things about Trump, but the reality is that Trump is bad for America and you're making a mistake by voting for him. When you do that, you make people defensive and they don't listen to what you have to say, even if you're right, even if you're making a really good argument. Instead, we need to help people draw their own conclusions and decide for themselves that Trump isn't the best person to represent them politically, that the MAGA movement isn't something they personally want to be a part of. So how do we do that? How do we help them think more freely and critically about MAGA and Trumpism? So one of the ways we do that is by highlighting ambivalence. We take things that they say and kind of hold them up side by side. This isn't the same as saying, oh, you're a hypocrite. It's noting that somebody feels pulled in 2 directions. So for example, let's say they are talking about their feelings about wanting a strong leader, right? So what you can say is, so one of the things I'm hearing you saying is that you like Trump because he's really strong and decisive. In some ways, he feels like he's going to take control of an out of control situation and make it better. And you like that idea. But on the other end of that, I also hear you saying that you are wary of government and that sometimes you worry that government has too much power. How do you, reconcile those two things? That's a way that you highlight ambivalence, remind people of the contradictions in their thinking, but without simultaneously making them defensive. That allows them to resolve the cognitive dissonance, hopefully in a way that moves them just a little bit away from Trump and MAGA. Another thing we can do is provide information that helps them understand possibly why Trump and MAGA have so much influence over them, why they are drawn to them, or information that perhaps contradicts misinformation that they're hearing in the media. Again, you can't just come out and say, well, that's wrong. Look at this, look at this book, look at this article, look at this video. You'll see that the story you're hearing is incorrect. Instead, you have to be careful when presenting information to do it in a way that doesn't make people feel threatened. So an example of a way you might do that would be to first ask them if it's okay to share information with them. Once you have their permission and they're agreeing to maybe consider an alternative perspective, then you can offer it to them and do so in a way that leaves it up to them whether or not they'll actually engage with the material or not. You're not going to force it down their throats, but you're making it available to them if they are curious enough to check it out. Another way to make a real difference in the way people are thinking, to cultivate doubt, is to share your experiences or the experiences of others. If you tell someone facts and figures and make a reasoned argument, they can fight back against that. They can rebut your conclusions. They can dismiss your evidence. They can present evidence of their own that makes it really hard to get through to them. But if you share your experience, they can't come back and tell you, well, your experience is wrong. That's your subjective experience, so you can share it. So one of the things that can be really powerful is to talk about a time when you heard Trump say something that had an impact on you, or talk about a time when maybe you thought that Trump was a better guy than he actually was, and tell a story about how it changed your mind. Sometimes the most powerful thing, though, is not to talk about it, Trump or MAGA at all, but to tell a story about a time you realized you were wrong about something really important, something that meant a lot to you, and maybe how hard it was for you to change your mind. When you tell a story like that, you give people permission to change their minds too, and to reflect more on whether there are beliefs that they hold that maybe they should be shifting. Another thing that can be really powerful is to contrast the ideal with reality. We already talked about that with regard to talking about what your ideal president would be, as opposed to talking about Trump. And then a final approach that I often use is to ask what it would take to change their mind, to not push them on it, not to argue with them, not to say, you aren't even open, you don't have an open mind, but to say, okay, you're really supportive of Trump. I get that. Is there anything that would cause you to kind of rethink your opinion about him, or are you locked in no matter what? And sometimes just asking that question is enough to get people thinking about what it really is that they're so attached to in this case. Now, the things I'm offering here.
Sorry, I'm gonna give you a little break. Whenever your voice gets cracky, I'm like, oh, I'll give Karen a break. I
Okay.
want to say that about the cultivating doubt. I've been telling folks lately, we are in a rare window right now this spring. Aside from the hardcore MAGA Trump devotees, a lot of Republicans in my life just kind of weren't paying attention, didn't really think that Donald Trump was going to get the nomination again. And right now, March and April, they're kind of in a little bit of a limbo. They don't like him. They're Republicans and they vote for Republicans. And if you give them time, they will get convinced over the summer to vote for Trump, talk themselves into it. The media, Fox News will talk them into it. Right now is a great time to say, I know you're not 100%, on board with Trump. And this is the time to kind of wedge in through that little crack, because as the summer goes on and things heat up, they're gonna retreat to their safe Republican tent and just use that as an excuse.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. So locking them in while the crack is there is really important.
Oh, and I want to follow up with a question because it applies directly to what we're talking about. Deb asks, is it important to remember that they may not share that doubt with us in the moment? They might think about it later. And also Melinda said they probably won't do their thinking in front of us. And that's a huge point about having these conversations, is you're planting seeds that may take root for later.
Yeah, you never quite know how this is all going to play out. Some people are going to feel really safe with you, and they're going to open up and be more than happy to talk about their reservations. In some ways, it's partly their personality. It's partly how new this type of thinking is to them. It's partly just how comfortable they feel with you. But even if they don't open up in the moment, don't assume that you haven't had a big impact on them. Sometimes people just need to go away for a while and think about it on their own in order to shift. And this cultivating doubt process can take a while. For some people, it happens fast. For some people, it can take months. Part of the reason we're starting this project, early in 2024 is because, we have a long time between now and the election to really have an impact on the people in our lives. If we were to wait, like Locke said, until the summer, by then their positions may have already hardened, and it may be too late to have the impact that we can have if we start now.
Yeah, and remember that Fox News and Republican Party know this, and they're going to be trying to go after those people with doubts right now.
Yep.
So if we leave them alone, they'll fall back into this way.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. The last thing I'll say on this is that this is just a sampler. There are plenty of ways to cultivate doubt, and we explore those in other webinars and other in our Sunday night group, and we're always developing new ones. So don't see this as an exhaustive list. So if you're wondering, where in the trust pyramid does this cultivate doubt part fall, really, I put it in the credibility section. Credibility is about the part of your relationship with the person you're talking about or talking with, that where you demonstrate that you yourself are an open-minded person, that you're rational, that you aren't bringing up crazy ideas and trying to impose them upon them, but actually that you can weigh evidence in a reasonable fashion. When you say something like, I'm wrong about a topic, that really enhances your credibility, even though it feels like it actually should undermine our credibility. When you admit that you're wrong, that means that the person you're talking with can trust you to be humble and not make claims that you really don't believe in, right? So credibility is important when you get to this point of cultivating doubt because it means they're more likely to listen to what you have to say.
And credibility is a tricky word because we think of credentials, when we think of like academic or intellectual background or facts. What we really mean by credibility is they trust you as a person. You've been talking to them, you've been building comfort. It's not like, oh, when I talk to my family, it's not, oh, Locke knows all this stuff. He's smart. I guess I'll listen to him. It's more, oh, I feel comfortable. Locke has listened to me. He's connected with me on some other issues, and maybe I'll give him a shot. So credibility is the right word, but don't think of it as learning, as we'd say back in Iowa, as heart connection, human
Yeah,
connection.
yeah, absolutely. So with coming back to the persuasion conversation cycle, you're probably wondering, okay, where does this credibility part come in? And where does the cultivating doubt part come in? It primarily comes in step 5, which is the share. That's where you can share your own personal story that can kind of shift the narrative. That's where you can share information after getting permission to share new information. And then it's really important once you do these things to continue the cycle, keep moving through it by asking more questions. And the question isn't one that's like, so do you agree with me? but rather something along the lines of, so, what do you think about that? Have you had similar experiences? Do you is if you shared some information, ask them if they had a chance to check it out and what they thought of it. You always, as you're moving through this process, doing everything you can to keep them from getting defensive, because as soon as they become defensive, the conversation shuts down. And the final step in the process is to motivate. People get to a place where they're starting to think differently, but they're not necessarily ready to make a change. And that's because, let's face it, change is hard. For a lot of Trump voters, a lot of people who are really caught up in the MAGA movement, making a shift to admitting that maybe their membership in that group wasn't the best idea, that their past support for Trump maybe wasn't well advised, getting to a place where they leave the Republican Party, those are all really hard things to do. I know for a lot of people in like rural communities where Locke spends a lot of his time, everybody in the community kind of knows what political party you belong to, and it's very closely tied up with your religion, and everybody in your family votes the same way. And if you make a big political change, that can put your relationships at risk. Ultimately, which is more important to you, your relationship or the vote you cast in a political election? For a lot of people, they're going to choose their relationship. Another thing that is worth thinking about is the impact on people's egos. If somebody has been supporting Trump wholeheartedly since 2016, it can be so hard to admit that they were wrong. That is, embarrassing, to say the least, if you finally reach the point where you're willing to admit that this is a really bad guy and basically I was conned by him. So what do we do about that? Basically, it's our job to make that transition easier, to support them in making the shift. Part of it is about giving them a safe place to land. We don't say, well, you're a bad person because it took you so long, or what took you so long to make that shift. What we say is, welcome. That, we're so happy that you have joined us. and we don't engage in shame or recrimination, because that's just going to push them back toward Trump and MAGA. Another thing we can do that's really helpful is help them develop new interests and activities. I know a lot of people have family members who spend just enormous amounts of time watching Fox News, listening to listening to talk radio, scrolling the internet, looking at right-wing social media posts. All of those things are reinforcing their current belief system. If we are going to get them to shift, we need to shift their environment. And that means helping them find new activities, new ways to entertain themselves that are not reinforcing their commitment to Trumpism and MAGA. And another thing is just fostering new healthy relationships. As they make the shift, they're going to need to get to know people outside their traditional circle, which was reinforcing their beliefs. They need people to be close to who aren't kind of the usual MAGA crowd, whoever that may be. So we can play a role in helping that happen, and even becoming those people for them. One of the places in the pyramid where this really lands for me is in compassion. As progressives and folks on the left, we tend to think that we are extremely compassionate people, that we are way more compassionate than those conservatives who are so heartless when it comes to helping the poor and downtrodden. But if we're honest with ourselves, I think most of us will admit that we're really, really bad when it comes to extending compassion to people who don't agree with us already on the political issues. Usually when a Republican expresses their version of suffering, whatever it may be, whether they talk about how they're being injured by inflation, whether they express concerns about what will happen to them if they can't keep a gun in their house, whether they're talking about their fears about what will happen to their job if more immigrants are allowed into the country. Our response isn't to offer compassion and try to help them feel emotionally more secure, but rather to invalidate their concerns. And when you invalidate people's concerns, they become defensive and they shut down and they stop listening. So we need to learn to be compassionate, not just toward people who already agree with us, but toward everybody, including people who don't already see the world the way that we do.